Thank you so much for coming to our talk this morning. I'm going to introduce you to the wonderful Julian Baggini, whose new book, How to Think Like a Philosopher, is going to be the subject of our talk today. My name is Juliet Russell, and I work predominantly in music, but in 2008 I set up an event in London called Salon London about ideas in live spaces, so taking big ideas to a wider audience. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoy our session. So I'm going to introduce you first of all to Julian Baggini, and Julian is a philosopher, a journalist, and an author of over 20 books, and he's a brilliant communicator. He writes about philosophy in a way that makes it clearer, relevant and usable for us, for the general public, for people who may not be a specialist in philosophy, but who really want to know more. He co-founded the Philosopher's Magazine and has written for numerous international magazines and newspapers, and he's also a patron of Humanists UK, which is an organisation that promotes secular humanism. Julian was awarded his PhD from University College London, and he also has an honorary doctorate and is an honorary research fellow of the University of Kent. Julian has written extensively using philosophy to explore a wealth of subjects, including identity, food, secularism, and ethics. His latest book, How to Think Like a Philosopher, offers us an insight into processes and tools to help us think more clearly and more deeply about ourselves and the world that we live in. Please give a huge, warm, melting pot welcome to the wonderful Julian Baggini. Julian, thank you so much for writing this book. What I'd like to do just to start off is, how did you, because in the UK system, we don't really learn philosophy in school in a structured way. How did you first get kind of bitten by the bug of philosophy?
Well, thank you very much, and ahoy, wonderful to be here. Just out of interest, do they teach philosophy in Czech schools or not? Okay, I'm getting this, yeah. No, we don't in the UK. So how was I interested? Well, my father was someone who had a kind of philosophical disposition. He left school when he was 14. He didn't have any education, but he liked to read philosophy, and he particularly liked Plato's Republic, which is probably not the best book to really love, I'm afraid. But I think he just encouraged that idea that you think for yourself and you question things. And then at school, the subjects that most interested me were, philosophical subjects. So in Britain, you specialise at age 16. You choose 3 subjects. Well, you did when I was at school. And I chose religious studies and politics and also English literature. So I just got into the big ideas and big questions. So I thought philosophy was what I wanted to do. I went to do it at university. I found that it wasn't exactly what I expected, but I still grew to love it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think with How to Think Like a Philosopher, one of the main, it's a very altruistic book. You're really giving us the tools to think more clearly. And I wonder whether you think we are living in an age where it's very difficult to think more clearly, or whether this has been a kind of problem through the ages.
Yeah, so in the introduction of the book, my editor wanted me to make it sound as though publishers always want a book to sound as though it is perfect for this exact moment in time, right? And she wanted me to stress how we're living in a moment where philosophical thinking has never been more necessary, etc. And I kind of, the way I met that by saying that it's true that in a sense we urgently need philosophy now, but that's because we always do. I don't know if there is anything special about this time. Whenever you look through history, people will complain that the public discourse is not intelligent enough, or there's not enough clear thinking. So I think, I say something in the book like, the reason why this book is timely, timely meaning, you know, we need it now, is that the advice in it is timeless. It applies at all times. So yeah, I wouldn't exaggerate the extent to which we live in unphilosophical times, although I think probably, you know, things like social media have encouraged people to think even more quickly and less carefully than they should. And I think that's one of the key points. So again, if you go to an airport or a bookshop, they have a section in Britain now, they have a section they call smart thinking, right? So it's all these books on how to be a better thinker. They're often written by scientists or psychologists or neuroscientists. And again, the way they are sold is that they promise you kind of shortcuts and hacks, you know, ways to think better but easily and quickly. And again, I say in the introduction to this book that this is kind of the opposite. I want to not give you hacks for thinking, but to give you, I call them cognitive speed bumps. You know, speed bumps are the things in the road that slow down the car. What we need to think better is mostly to slow down and give it more time and be more careful. And the more we look for like shortcuts and hacks, that's not going to be very helpful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think, just to say to the audience as well, we're going to have an in-conversation for around 40 minutes, and then I'll open it up to questions. I think the book dispelled quite a lot of myths for me. And I think one of the things I maybe had a preconception about, which was incorrect, or the way you reframe it, is I felt like philosophy really dealt with the cerebral, but actually for you, it's really about the experiential. It's about being in relationship. So that there are a lot of kind of moving parts to it. It's very much about lived experience as much as cognitive experience. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, the point is the book's called How to Think Like a Philosopher. Now, the first question, if you have a skeptical question, is, well, which philosopher, right? Because not all philosophers think in exactly the same way. So when I say how to think like a philosopher, it's a kind of an ideal of what a philosopher should be. And you know, philosophers do have different interests. And some philosophy is, like you say, it's very cerebral, it's very much theoretical. But philosophy has also had its side, which is about lived experience. And I think that it depends on what you're thinking about. Now, if your subject is logic, for example, that your subject is logic, it is very abstract. But a lot of the subjects of philosophy do concern everyday life. They concern how we should live, how we understand ourselves, human nature, how we should organize society, what we should take to be true and false. I mean, these things are everyday practical things. So I think that it should be involved in that. But the other thing you said, you used this word relational, yeah? Now I think this to me is a very important thing. In Western philosophy, I think if you ask someone to imagine a philosopher, what do they imagine, right? What comes into your mind if I say philosopher? If we had a smaller group, we could ask. But typically, people may think of, first of all, the Rodin statue, the thinker, you know, the person like this, sitting like that. You might think of Descartes and his meditations, where he's sitting in his room thinking about what is true, what is reality. One might think of Nietzsche wandering the mountains. In all of these cases, first of all, unfortunately, we have to accept the fact that these are mostly men. And I have to apologize in the book because I do quote more men than women, but that is simply the result of the fact that the history of the subject, as in most things, women have not been given their fair platform. It's changing quite a lot now in philosophy, and I think some of the best contemporary philosophers are now the female philosophers. But, okay, male or female, we have the image of the philosopher as the solitary thinker. You sit there thinking like Rodin's statue by yourself. And that's actually a very, I think, a harmful idea of what philosophy is. Because we also know from psychologists that actually people think better when they think together. And this is something that you see through the history of philosophy. So if you, ancient Greek philosophy, we think of Socrates and Aristotle. Both of those established communities of thinkers. Plato had his academy. Aristotle had the Lyceum. In classical Indian philosophy, a lot of that was involved in groups coming together and debating, sometimes for hours and hours and hours. Similarly, you know, if you read the Analects of Confucius, Kongzi, the great Chinese philosopher, again, it's about the master and the disciples. So, and even in the sort of Descartes was corresponding with other thinkers all the time. They were giving objections. So thinking is really something that we do best when we do it with other people. So I actually got a little, as a little bit of merchandise for my book, I got a fridge magnet, right? And it has this expression on it, it's think for yourself, because you're always told think for yourself, right? But think for yourself, but not by yourself. By yourself meaning alone. So you think for yourself, but you have to think with other people. I have to say, I often get letters from people, and the way to madness is to sit in a room and just try and think for yourself and not talk to other people. People tend to end up with crazy theories when they do that.
Great. And that's nice to know the burden on all of the thought isn't on us. It's a kind of team effort, and you can only really solve a lot of today's complex problems by multidisciplinary approaches in a team. So I think that social aspect of the book came through. I'm going to just take a step back, but we'll come back to this theme because you touched briefly on that Eastern philosophies and how that is more about groups and its relationship. And also there's a very simple first step. So in the book, Julian gives us kind of 12 kind of processes through which to explore clearer thinking. And at the end of the book, he'll give us a summary. So it's a very usable, relevant book. But the first one is a very simple one that we can all do. But I wonder if you can also clarify, and it's about attentiveness. Yeah. And how close is that to mindfulness? And how much is that a kind of more recent thing in a Western tradition? And has it always been a part of Eastern traditions?
Yeah. Okay, so this is interesting. So this is perhaps one of the things that I've most changed my opinions about since I started philosophy. So when you ask someone who is educated in Western philosophy, you know, what do you need to do philosophy? They'll typically say it's about arguments. So you construct rational arguments. And there are lots of formal tools for how you do that. Now, although that's an important part of philosophy, over the years I've become more convinced that even more important than that is, as I say, is paying attention, attending very carefully to whatever it is you are thinking about. And it struck me that if you look at some of the most important pieces of Western philosophy, that's what the philosopher is doing more than they are having an argument, okay? So I'll give you an example. So if I was to ask a group of people, you know, give me a philosophical quotation, the one that I certainly, I don't know if it's the same here, but in Britain, people would probably say Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Everyone knows that. So I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, Latin. It looks like an argument. I think, therefore I am. Actually, if you go back to one of the texts in which Descartes formulates this idea, his Meditations, he doesn't actually put it in that way. He says that so what's he trying to do? Descartes is trying to establish what can we be certain of? And he goes through everything. Can I be certain that there's a bottle of water here? No, because I might be dreaming, I might be hallucinating. It'd be a very nice dream, you know. It is a bit of a dream to be here, actually. This is very, very wonderful. But, you know, I might literally be dreaming. Can I be sure about even that I have a body? Well, no, you know, I could be a brain in a vat. Maybe it's like the Matrix or something, or maybe I live in a virtual reality. So he goes through everything one by one. But he concludes the one thing he cannot doubt is that he is thinking. Because if you're thinking, you are definitely thinking. Maybe you're wrong about where you are, what you are, but you must be thinking. Now, the point about that is that how he reaches that conclusion is not by an argument. It's really by carefully paying attention to what is and is not the case or might not be the case, and noticing that you cannot doubt you are thinking. That is the one thing it is impossible to doubt. So Descartes, and famous as a rationalist philosopher, at his heart, he's doing a very careful piece of observation, right? And I think it's been there in Western philosophy always, but it's not given enough appreciation. People think it's all about logic and argument. I think certainly, if you classical Indian philosophy and classical Chinese philosophy, there's more of an appreciation that careful attention is an essential part of the thinking process. So, yeah.
And I think as well, in the book you say actually that settling of the mind before embarking on something and some intentional thinking has actually been really useful. Yeah,
okay, so you also said, does it have any connection with mindfulness? Now again, this is very interesting, and I read a very interesting thing from an American philosopher who works on Japanese philosophy, and as part of a job I had. But she says it's quite interesting if you think about it. In both the Indian and the Chinese traditions, it's totally mainstream to have the idea that if you are going to embark on philosophical thinking, you ought to prepare your mind. Yeah, so perhaps do some breathing exercises, or something like this. And this is just totally mainstream. Now, in Western philosophy, that idea has been, no one would think about that. You don't do breathing, why? But actually, if you think about it, it's strange to think that there's no reason to do it. The mind is a very complicated thing. It's a very busy thing as well, right? So one of the most fun things you can do, or perhaps disturbing things you can do, try it in a quiet moment of the festival, is just sit for a moment and just try and observe what's going on in your mind. And it's sometimes quite almost disturbing how jumbled it is. It's just crazy, and thoughts come, things happen here and there. So the idea that if you're going to think, you ought to prepare your mind should be, I think, a mainstream thing. So yeah, I think that's an important thing we don't appreciate enough in Western thinking.
Thank you. And there's another aspect of the book. You ask us to question everything, even our own questions. And there's two parts to that, really. I think one is, do we have the time to question everything? That's a lot. Or do we, talking about a very specific context, and how important is the recognition of self and positionality when we're exploring questions and the recognition of that?
I'm going to ask you about that second question again in a minute, because
okay.
I want to get clearer on it. But
okay.
Question everything is a really interesting piece of advice, so the way I start that chapter is, I quote somebody who says, you should question everything, not believe what you're told, check things out for yourself, right? Giving all the advice that everyone always gives about thinking. Who is this person? He's a person who believes that the world is flat, right? So this, I think, is an important sort of like warning. If you question everything in the wrong way, you can end up with crazy conclusions. This is a man who is, everybody knows the world is round and it's not flat, right? Everybody knows that, and no one even thinks about it. He questioned it. And when he questioned it, he came to some very strange answers about it, because he had the desire to question, but he didn't seem to have the intellectual skill to find the right answers. So this is, I think, a slightly worrying thing. When people talk about how important it is to think for yourself and to question things, I sometimes think that the best thing is to question everything carefully, intellectually, and smartly. The second best thing is not to question everything, right? If you just accept most things you're told, then you'll be right most of the time. And if you're wrong, well, other people are wrong too. It's not your fault. The people in the middle is the most problematic. The people who don't accept what they're told and question things, but they don't have the patience or the skill or the intellect to question things properly, they end up dismissing, they end up conspiracy theories and flat earth, etc., etc. Do we have time to question everything? Well, the point there is there is a time and a place to question everything. So if you go back to Descartes' meditations, Descartes had the idea that once in a lifetime you should ask yourself, what can I be certain of and what can I not be certain of? And having gone through that process, you don't have to repeat it, right? So questioning everything doesn't mean at every moment. So, for example, there's no reason for me at this moment to question whether this bottle is here. That's a crazy thing to do. It's inefficient use of time. So I think it's worth questioning everything, but at the right time, at the right moment. In day-to-day life, you have to go on making assumptions all the time. The idea you can live without assumptions is crazy. But what was the second point about?
I was talking about, because you say question everything, even your own questions. And for me, that kind of threw up a few things in terms of understanding your own positionality, because I think we often take for granted what's normal because it's our experience, or we're surrounded by people who think that. But also that idea of confirmation bias and our role within questioning and taking responsibility, I suppose, for that.
Yeah. Okay, so very good question, Juliet. So, yeah, I think it's one of the underappreciated skills in thinking well is cultivating self-awareness. You have to sort of understand yourself better. So, for example, if you read something on social media or a newspaper or something like this, you'll probably find that you will have an immediate reaction, right? There are some things you read and you go, yeah, sure, I knew it, kind of thing, or ha, Other things you read and you go, ah, crazy, wrong. Okay, you have an immediate reaction. Now, I think the point is that those immediate reactions are, again, they're natural. Of course you have them, because every time we discover something new or read something new, we bring to it all our assumptions, all our other beliefs. So it's perfectly natural. But we ought to kind of notice this. So if I find myself hearing somebody talk and I have the feeling of resistance, that I'm rejecting this, I ought to ask myself, why am I rejecting it? Do I have good reasons for rejecting it? Or am I rejecting it for some kind of bad reason? A typical thing will be this. With politicians, there are some politicians we like and some politicians we don't like. Now, sometimes, the point is, most people are not 100% correct about everything or 100% wrong about everything. So if I was to hear a speech, I'll be honest, I should declare some political interests here. If I hear Donald Trump's voice, I will immediately be sort of going, and hate it, right? But one time in 100 or something, Donald Trump will probably say something true. Actually, I don't know if that is true. He seems to be incapable of it. But anyway, not Donald Trump. But you think of an example, someone you disagree with. But sometimes they say things which are true. But when you have that automatic resistance to them, you find yourself rejecting what they're saying because it's them saying it. And you should say, well, hang on, maybe this time they're right. And similarly, if someone we admire says something, we're very willing to believe it. Well, maybe we shouldn't. So I think we should be trying to cultivate an awareness of ourselves and our own attitudes and how that may be colouring our interpretation of what we're hearing. And that's quite a difficult thing to do, I think.
But worth pursuing.
Absolutely, but it's all difficult. That's the point. Thinking well is difficult. And that is why even very good thinkers make terrible mistakes. And in fact, sometimes one of the worries I have is that I've heard philosophers say very silly things, often when they're talking about things which are not exactly philosophy. So, for example, some philosophers, when they talk about real-world politics, are very naive and But I sometimes worry that because they are philosophers and they think, I am a very good thinker, that is my job, they become too confident, and that is part of what enables them to make mistakes. So I think, even the smartest people can get things wrong, particularly when they're thinking about something outside of their expertise. So modesty is another important virtue. In fact, sorry, I'm on a roll now. One of the things I try to encourage in the book is that we tend to think about critical thinking and good thinking as a kind of a skill, right? Where you need sort of practical tools like logic and so forth. And I'm trying to balance that with the idea that being a good thinker is also a lot to do with what we call virtues. So it's about your character, it's about your integrity. So to be a good thinker, you have to be honest, you have to be sincere, and you have to be patient, things like this, yeah? Now, these things don't sound like intellectual skills, but actually they are. They're important intellectual skills, and which we neglect. We think it's just all about brain power and logic.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, well, two questions, but I'll ask you the first one. Could you talk about our ego? When is it important for a philosopher to have an ego, and when is it important for them to not have one?
Ooh, I don't know if they should ever have one. In a way, you should try to get your ego out of the way. I mean, you have to have the. What do we mean by ego, right?
Julian has a whole book on that.
We have to be aware of the fact that we come to everything as an individual with a particular view. So you can't eliminate the ego in that sense. But the ego in the sense of a kind of pride, you have to think without pride, absolutely. And I think a lot of the times people go wrong is when they become invested in a particular point of view. So in other words, you've been thinking about something, you reach a conclusion, you have a point of view, and that point of view kind of becomes part of your identity, and then you don't want to give it up. And so I think that in order to be genuinely open-minded, you have to sort of be willing to accept that you might be wrong, even about things you believed for a long time, which is perhaps the most difficult thing of all.
Yeah, and there's actually something that really rings true and comes through in the book, which is seek clarity, not certainty. And I think there's a kind of part of the human experience is to want to have certainty, yet accepting that there isn't a lot of certainty is incredibly liberating. But how can we have better clarity, and how can we learn to live with uncertainty?
Okay, good question. So I'll tell you a story. I wrote a book once about free will. Do we have free will to make our own choices? And the first time I gave a talk about this book, right? I was at a book festival, and I gave the talk, and the first hand came up for a question, and the person said, "I came to this talk because I wanted to understand what free will was better. And at the end of it, I'm now even less sure than I was at the beginning." And then they sat down, and that was the question. So I sort of initially said, "Oh, well, I'm sorry, everybody, I failed, and maybe I should go home." But then I thought, well, actually, I think that's kind of okay. So there are lots of things in life where basically we have a vague and fuzzy idea, yeah? I think free will is one of them. Ask most people, do you have free will? You go, yeah, I think so. You have a sense that you can make a free choice. But you haven't really, most people have not sat down and really thought about, well, what does it mean to have free will, etc. So you start with a vague and fuzzy idea. And when ideas are vague and fuzzy, they often seem simple and straightforward. When you start thinking about things more deeply, you see the complexity. So if you like, instead of this blurred image, the image comes into focus, and in the focus you see it's very, very complicated, right? So, and that makes it initially more confusing, right? So when you seek clarity, I think you have to accept the fact that clarity will often bring with it, initially at least, more complexity. You realize things are not as simple as you thought they were, and you have to deal with that. And that's a very important first step. Virtually everything that really matters and is important, when you look at it, you find out the answer is that it is complicated. And in fact, we were talking earlier just about one example, diet, for example. What does it mean to eat well? Well, it's complicated, and lots of people want to sell you a simple answer because that would be very pleasing. You know, if all you have to do is, I know, eat 5 fruit vegetables a day, or cut out this, or eat a supplement, that's easy, but it's not. It's complicated, and we don't like that. So clarity, I think, is connected with complication, and that's one reason we don't like it. Now, the other thing is certainty. Wouldn't it be great to be certain? I mean, certainty is very, very appealing. And accepting that there just is no certainty in most matters is difficult. I think one way in which we can become more comfortable with that is to recognize the inevitability of it, right? Once you recognize that uncertainty is actually almost is the only certainty, then it becomes a fact of life. There's no point in fighting it because you're fighting something that can't be defeated. David Hume was the great Scottish philosopher of the 18th century, and he had a really nice way of putting this. He distinguished things. He said there were things like mathematics or linguistic truths, such as, you know, all unmarried men are bachelors. You know, bachelor just means an unmarried man. So all unmarried men are bachelors is true by definition. So things are true by definition, things are true in mathematics. These are the only certainties. Anything that concerns knowledge of the real world cannot be certain in that way, because it all depends just on evidence of experience, and the evidence of experience is never conclusive. So I think you just get used to it. I think with a lot of difficult ideas, the way you become more comfortable with them is you just kind of live with them for a while, and then you get used to them. I think there's a lot of just, you know, people are disturbed when they have new ideas they haven't had before, and that just becomes disturbing. Give it time, and it becomes okay.
Yeah, and you talk about that commitment to the sort of lifelong process of acquiring knowledge and becoming more comfortable with your processes around thinking. How are you all? Are you okay? You're keeping up. That's good. Wonderful.
Well, this lot are very okay. Look at them.
They're wonderful. Yeah.
I'm glad to see. I can't see anyone actually sleeping, which is quite good, because I wouldn't be surprised. I think if I was in your position, I might be asleep. So thank you for not sleeping. I appreciate it.
I want to pick up on 2 things that you said, and the first is around complexity, and then I'd like to talk a bit about eclecticism. But the first question, how can we, if we want to think like a philosopher, how can philosophy help us to really tackle some of the huge issues, the scale of which sometimes is so confusing with us? So if we take a subject like climate crisis, it feels too huge for us to solve as individuals, and obviously it is too big. How can we use philosophy to really make a difference in some of the key issues of our time?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I think the answer is that philosophy's role is as a partner with others, right? I don't think there are many issues where philosophers can just come in with the answers. So philosophy is not Superman, it's not the savior, it's not salvation. But I think philosophers, when it comes to real world issue, work best when they collaborate with other people. In a way, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. In lots of areas, you ask, who is the expert? And the answer is, well, the expert is actually a collective, right? So who's an expert on climate change? Well, there are people who study the science of climate change, right? There are people who study technological solutions. There are people who study behavioral psychology and how we might adapt our behavior. There are people who deal with politics and economics, redistributing wealth and incentive. You know, you see what I mean? There's the climate issue touches on many, many different disciplines. And so to bring it to work, you need to have all those people working together. Philosophers are often useful in, I think, first of all, well, they should be quite good at bringing out some of the conceptual issues, clarifying some of the key things. They should be useful in helping us to be clearer about the values which are motivating our thoughts. And they should also be quite good, I think, about combining these ideas, balancing them and seeing how the different ideas can or cannot fit together or work against each other. So I think that philosophy is important in public life as a collaborator, not as the external expert. And I think that's the way it works. And there's good experience of that. So, for example, in the UK, there was a very, very wonderful philosopher called Mary Warnock. Mary Warnock was a very modest woman. She always said that as a philosopher, she says she was a second division philosopher, right? Which is very modest. In a way, she was correct in the sense that she did not make much of an original contribution to the academic study of philosophy. But she was the chair of 2 government committees which looked into some very important issues around the education of people with disabilities, I think, and also bioethics issues around in vitro fertilization. And as a philosopher, as a chair of the committee, she was able to bring people together with different expertises and to come up with recommendations which people accepted and became laws. So I think that's really the part of the role philosophy has, yeah.
And I think that's what your book does brilliantly. It shows us the kind of application of philosophy. So I think before I read it, I thought you were going to have look at problems through different lenses of different philosophers. But actually your approach to eclecticism is huge. You give us loads of different examples of how to apply philosophy, but not really from one school at all. You actually sort of help us to lean in, and at the end of the book there's a whole list of philosophers and sort of their key works for you to explore more. So that eclecticism part, you encourage us to be eclectic, and can you talk to us a little bit more about that? And I don't know whether you can bring in as well a little bit around group behaviours and groupthink. Is that 2 separate questions?
Maybe, but I tell you what, I've got to tell you a funny story, actually. Well, you may not think it's funny. I'm not sure it's funny. But anyway, this book's called How to Think Like a Philosopher. And about 3 or 4 months before it was due to be published, we noticed that there was another book going to be published at the same time called How to Think Like a Philosopher. Can you believe it? It's not a very... It turns out it was a very good title, but it was an obviously good title, and somebody else had written a book with the same title. And the publishers talked about it, but no one wanted to change their mind. So there were 2 books out called How to Think Like a Philosopher. If you go to the bookshop at the festival, they have the other one. I think it was a mistake, but there you go. But that's interesting because I didn't read it. I'm not bitter. But in that book, exactly is the approach. It's like saying, this is how Plato would think about this. This is how Kant would think about it. And I didn't want to do that because I don't think that's very useful because, I don't think the way to do philosophy is to choose your philosopher and then let that philosopher be your guide. You use the term eclectic. I think that we need to draw upon the best ideas of different philosophers. But not just philosophers. We also need to think about psychologists and sociologists and historians and economists. The best thinkers in history, I think, have generally been ones that have had those broad conversations. David Hume, who I mentioned earlier, was great friends and an intellectual friend of Adam Smith. Adam Smith we think of now as an economist, but he was also something of a philosopher too. And I think a lot of the best philosophers today, they also draw on those different disciplines. So I think that is, to me, that is the way to think. You need to, why limit yourself to one thing? Also, I think when people become too much of a disciple of one philosopher, they have this expression in English, I don't know if you have it in Czech, which is, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So the idea is, if you're a hammer, you're always looking for things you can go with, you know. And in the same kind of way, if you're a Platonist, then every time you think about something, you kind of think, oh, what would Plato think? How would Plato think about it? You're always trying to fit something into a very narrow way of thinking. So I think we should be broad. When you say something about groupthink, yeah. It probably is a different question, but it's still a good question. Because rewind about half an hour ago, I said it's important that we think together. But then people say, we also know that it can be dangerous to have the groupthink, as we call it. So if you're online and all the people you're speaking to online and all the web pages you go to are people with a similar point of view, you end up just sort of having a very narrow vision of the world and only confirming your view. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. So this is one of those things where, again, it's not easy, it's complicated. You have to have this balance of, I think one should try and get out of one's own head and think widely. But you've got to also make sure that the people you talk to, literally, or the people you read, are not all of the same opinion, because that just ends up narrowing your view in another way.
And is that really where the psychology element comes into play? Is that because there's a chapter in the book where you really encourage us to let philosophy sit really alongside psychology? Yeah,
I think the point about the psychology is that we don't really fully understand. Well, we understand theoretically maybe, but in the moment, in day-to-day life, we're not aware of all the reasons why we think what we do, or why, you know, a lot of these things are going on under the surface. But psychology has enabled us to learn a lot about that. And I think that you ought to be, everyone ought to be aware of what psychology has told us about how we think, so that we can become aware of where that might be distorting things for us. And again, this is very interesting, because I think that the best philosophers in the past were like this. David Hume, again, I've mentioned him again. I've written a whole book on David Hume. I think he's really great. He was a psychologist, and I found it really interesting that he identifies 2 or 3 things which we now think of as being phenomena discovered by, like, 20th century psychology. Confirmation bias, for example. You know, confirmation bias, we think, this is the idea that we pay more attention to beliefs that reinforce our views than those which contradict it. David Hume pretty much describes that in the 18th century in different terms. He was very, very aware of how our minds distort things, and we all ought to do that. And you do that by reading psychology. So, you know, in that smart thinking section of the bookshop, they will probably still have Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, for example. That's a book that everyone should read, you know. It's a psychology book that if you're interested in good thinking, don't just read philosophy, read that. In fact, you should probably read that before you read my book, seriously. So, you know, if you haven't read that and you can only buy 1 book today, go and buy that one. If you can buy 2, buy this one.
Great advice. There's so much more I could ask you, Julian, but I would love to open it up to questions to our audience. Thank you so much for listening to us so far, and please do have your questions ready for Julian. Gabriella, do we have a microphone, please, for the audience? Thank you. Who would like to go first?
Do we have some questions? Somebody has to be the brave person to ask the first one.
Yeah.
Ah, good.
Thank you. Gabriella, is someone there? Wonderful, thank you.
Hi. So you proposed that we should examine things very carefully. That's one, noticing. And then you also said that you're not upset that they're selling the other book in the bookstore. And are you really noticing your feelings very carefully about this?
Great question.
Yeah, okay, it's a very good question. Well, I think but this is a good point, because when we think about our feelings, I think one of the things that's not properly appreciated is how feelings are often complicated and mixed. I mean, I genuinely, you know, you have on social, on tweeting, LOL, laugh out loud, you know. I literally laughed out loud when I saw it, 'cause I thought, but obviously I was also a little bit irritated as well. And we often have these complex emotions. And this is a bit separate from philosophy, but I think one of the really things that we have trouble with is accepting complex emotions. It's like the certainty thing. We like to think we have, how do you feel about something? You want to have a simple answer, and often things are mixed. Now, I was just, strangely, I was only reading the other day about some study which was looking at brain imaging of people with what we think of as complex emotions. And it was interesting because they found that the brain imaging suggested that what we think of as complex emotions are actually not a mixture of like happy and sad, but something distinctive in their own way, right? Now, this is only one experiment, but I think it's interesting from that point of view. And just to give one example, I think where mixed emotions are really important. When I was writing my book on global philosophy, which is an event about tomorrow, by the way, one of the things that most struck me was this very dominant idea in Japanese thought, in which there is this combination, bittersweet emotion about the temporariness of life. So I don't know if anyone here is from Japan or has been to Japan. In Japan, the major holiday season is at the time of the cherry blossom, where the cherry blossom, beautiful trees come into flower. But the point about the cherry blossom is that it doesn't last very long at all. It's beautiful for a few days, the first strong wind, and it's gone, right? And this is a deep expression of a very core idea in Japanese thought, which is that, you know, that this is the human condition, which is that you'll walk around the festival today, and hopefully you'll be struck by how wonderful it is to be alive. And listening to music, I find this really, if you're listening to some really powerful music, you know, at the moment you're hearing that music, it's like, if someone asks you what's the point of being alive, that's the answer, it's the music. But it doesn't last, it won't last. There will become a point when it's not there. So at that moment of joy and appreciation, there's also this awareness, a sadness that it won't last. And have both those emotions at the same time and be aware of them. That requires a deep attention to your phenomenology. So anyway, a long answer to your question, but you're right to point out that I wasn't 100% happy.
Thank you. Any other questions? Hello. Hi. There's a woman down the front. Thank you. Thank you for running around with the microphone for us. Decree.
Hello. What do you think? What kind of philosopher is AI? Is it a philosopher?
Is what?
AI.
Oh, AI. Is AI a philosopher? Oh, my word. There's a lot of philosophy around AI. AI is the big question of the day. I think the problem is that most of us don't properly understand what AI is, and there's also a difference between what AI is now and what it could be. So as I understand it, most of what we call AI at the moment are what they call these large language models, and we know they're just crunching numbers. It is a mindless, unintelligent activity which has incredibly powerful results. So that kind of AI is definitely not doing philosophy, right? I'd hope. Could AI do philosophy in the future? Well, I don't want to rule anything in or out, you know. And if it does, we'll have to deal with it. I think sometimes, if I might take your questions and invitation to have more general thoughts about AI, some of the things people are scared about, they shouldn't be scared about. Let me give music as an example again, because we're at a music festival as well as an ideas festival. People think, what if AI, which it almost can do already, could write and perform pop and rock music, or any kind of music? What would that mean for real life performers, right? Now, I think the answer to that is that probably it would mean we would have both types of performer, because what do we love about music? Now, if an AI were to come up with a killer tune, right, you'd want to listen to it, definitely. I think that's true. But would you only want to listen to AI music? Isn't a lot of the joy of music about knowing it's the expression of an individual. You know, the musicianship, for example. You could get an AI to play a guitar solo, and it might sound wonderful, but that's not the same experience as watching or listening to David Gilmour play a guitar, where you know it's a human being producing this extraordinary beauty. So I think that a lot of the time AI will do things and we'll enjoy them, but we'll also enjoy the human created stuff, because the reasons are also a bit different. And a little example I might give you again is like a cake, right? It may be that the best cake in terms of a tasting experience you could buy in Ostrava is made by a factory. It's possible. I doubt it. You probably have a better bakery. It's also possible that if a friend made you a cake, as a cake, it would not be as good. It wouldn't be a very good cake. But the cake a friend makes for you is more enjoyable and appreciated more because it's made for you by your friend. So it's not just about the end result. It's about the whole process. And AI should be useful if it gives us end results that are useful to us. But a lot of the things that we value in life, we don't just value them for the end product. We value them for the whole social meaning, the process, the personal stuff. So it's not going to destroy music, comedy, dance, philosophy, or cookery.
Thank you. We have a question at the back there, and one there. Thank you.
Hi, nice to meet you. As you said about narrow thinking, I know a lot of people. They have a very, let's say, narrow view on the world. But I think that it makes the society quite polarized. I mean, either in that way or in the second way. And I think it's also they are becoming kind of aggressive even in the thinking. If you have any other opinion, you are trying to explain to them. Do you think due to this polarization of the society, is there maybe some major crisis coming in the future?
Okay, thanks very much. So the polarization which comes from narrow thinking really create a crisis. Well, I don't think you need to do a prediction. I mean, I think it's already creating obvious problems and crises, don't you think, with the polarization? Because, I mean, it seems to me that... Okay, let me step back from this. Just think about politics and society. What's the fundamental idea about democracy? Now, the fundamental idea about democracy is not about which exact process you use, the voting system, whatever it might be. The basic premise of a democracy that works is that it is a system which enables the fact that although in any given society people have different desires and beliefs and values, we find a way of reaching a view which we can all accept and go along with it, right? Which requires compromise. Now, I think the problem is that in lots of democracies now, people are not interested in the compromise. They think it's about you have an election and the winner takes it all, as we say. You know, the winner gets to decide, and the loser, you go away. We're not interested in keeping everybody happy, and so you've got people with very narrow views, and they think that democracy is about them winning more than 50%, and if they do that, they win, other people lose. And that has to be disastrous. And the problem with that is you wouldn't get to that position if you didn't have a narrow worldview. It should be possible for all of us to appreciate how people we disagree with are not just crazy or monsters. Usually, sometimes they are. And that we can understand their points of view. So, I don't know, I think the polarization you're describing is already making societies very volatile and fractured and make democracy problematic, because democracy doesn't work when the winner tries to claim everything for their team, as Donald Trump may do if he wins.
Thank you. Maybe last one. So do you
Sorry, we have someone else who had a question before, and we're very short of time.
Is there any crisis emerging, maybe? Or
yeah. Well, I think. Well, sure. I think, as I said, I think we're already seeing it. The crisis is an interesting word, but deep problems are already evident as a result of this polarization. Whether it reaches a disastrous crisis point, we will see.
Thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, hello. First of all, thank you for the space, for the conversation. I would like to come back to the complex emotions because I feel that is something we all can be related. And I would like to ask you, what are your best strategies as an individual to try to confront these complex emotions and not get drowned in either in the past for what happened or in the future or what might happen? How you stay in the present moment and how you can improve your life in that way?
Okay, so how as an individual do I sort of manage the sort of complexity of emotions? And, well, not just complexity of emotions, I think complexity of perhaps values as well. Because I think that sometimes our values are also somewhat conflicted. There was a very famous story told by Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher. It's always the one thing, another thing people always know about Sartre was a student came to him, it was during the war, and they had this dilemma, should they go and fight with the resistance or should they stay with their mother who would be devastated if they left? And the point was there was no clear answer because there were two different values here. There's a value of fighting for your country and there's a value for sticking with your family. And sometimes these things, it's not easy to decide between them. What are the strategies? Well, first of all, I think that, again, if you are prepared for the fact that there may be such really difficult choices and that there may be no way of knowing which is the right choice in this situation, then you are more prepared. Secondly, I think it's going back to the self-awareness. When you're faced with a difficult choice, you always should be checking whether or not there is some motivation which is making you go to one side or the other where perhaps you shouldn't. So, for example, I had an interesting experience recently where I discovered that one of my books had been censored in Chinese. I was very surprised because it wasn't a highly political book, but the Chinese censor everything now. They actually removed any reference to the Dalai Lama. Even though it had nothing to do with China, they won't have the Dalai Lama mentioned in the book, right? So here I have a dilemma. Complex values. Do I allow the book to be published with these cuts or do I withdraw it? And it is complicated, but one thing I have to think about is that obviously from a self-interest point of view, I have reasons for wanting the arguments to keep the book published to be good, right? I want there to be good reasons for that. So I have to be aware of that. And perhaps a third strategy is, and this is more complicated, is that when you sometimes what appears to be a kind of a black and white choice, an either or choice, if you think about it more carefully, it's not quite like that. So sometimes, you know, it might seem initially that there's just a conflict, it's this or that. And sometimes if you can push beyond that and recognize it's not quite like that, that actually maybe you can do both. With some imagination, sometimes you can take a difficult polarization and find a middle way. So there's some of the strategies, but basically it's always difficult, it's always complicated.
Thank you, Dekui, for all of your wonderful questions and presence at this event. Thank you so much. We do have copies of Julian's actual book here.
Yeah. Which the bookshop doesn't, so you can only buy them from us.
Only here. So if you want to see me afterwards, I'll be happy to give you a copy, to buy a copy. But please, thank you to everyone at Meltingpot, and please give a huge thank you to Julian Baggini. Thank you so much,
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Juliet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.